fast as I can. But I wanted to hit something because I've been noticing something recently, mostly with uh, Western gamers and Western consumers, I guess would be the term. Uh, that I wanted to hit, and I just want to see how people feel about it. And I'd be happy to have people do some video responses and leave comments on this because I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And that's the idea of the defense of a mature theme or mature content in art. Um, and if you guys aren't familiar with what the background there is, that is the Goblin Slayer uh, from the anime manga. And I was watching it earlier, and of course, anybody who doesn't know about Goblin Slayer, the first episode got a lot of heat because the first episode features a scene that is no other way to put it is very sexually graphic um, and incredibly mature. Um, it does involve sexual assault, uh, but let me go ahead and tell you this: if you've never watched it, it doesn't show anything. It's kind of it's there, but it's off screen kind of thing. Um, and that being said, it made me think about mature themes of art and how we, in as Western consumers, have kind of softened what we accept when we do things, whether it be games, books, whatever, and how mature things could be handled and should be handled. And I'll give you some good examples of what I think are good ways to handle it, some good bad ways using actual examples of things I've read and watched and done, um, things like that. But I'm just going to say up front, mature themes are good if you're a mature person. So that being said, when I say mature person, I'm not talking about being the ultimate adult or anything like that. I'm talking about being able to handle darker, more adult oriented concepts. You know, uh, and I'm going to start it off by saying, talking about Goblin Slayer. The reason that that scene is in Goblin Slayer, there's two reasons for it. If you watch Goblin Slayer, the first is it establishes what the goblins in the world are. They are monsters. They are not uh, fluffy little fairies. They are true monsters. They murder and eat people. They do awful things to women when they capture them. And the idea behind that scene is to kind of twofold show that they're monsters, but also to establish that part of the world. But the other part of it is to establish the one of the MC, one of the main characters, need to have Goblin Slayer come in and save her, which is fine. That's a standard part of it. They could have done it 1,000 different ways. They chose to use the scene where she needed to be saved to introduce the more mature aspect of what goblins in the world and the four corners are. So that being said, guys, mature themes like that can be used very appropriately when used that way. Plenty of film, plenty of books, plenty of RPGs have dealt with mature concepts for years. And over the last, I would say, probably 15 to 20 years, we've kind of edged away from the idea of using the darker, more mature aspects of our society to establish you know, things in the world because they're too sensitive for people. You don't want to offend people, but you can do that and be okay. And I'll give you a great example is World of Darkness. Really, through the years, if you go read first edition Vampire, you go read first edition Werewolf, things like that. There are a lot of very heavy themes in those games uh, that are very mature, very adult themes. But later editions, even into New World of Darkness or Chronicles of Darkness, whatever you want to call it, um, they kind of did away with those themes and kind of pushed those themes into the background where established GMs can still use them, but they're not front and center of the game. And the grand example of that is if you played original Vampire the Masquerade, uh, you're playing a character that is sexualized and very much romanticized by hundreds, if not thousands, of years of literature. And your character in that game, the horror of Vampire is the idea that you have to determine how far you will go to survive to the next night. Because as a vampire, the only thing standing between you and final death is your willpower, basically, to do what you have to do. Whether that be you're going to drink humans, you can decide you're going to live off of animals, you can decide all that stuff. And the maturity of that concept, in at least in original World of Darkness, was very heavy. It wasn't implied. It was very much front and center of the game, with the horror of the game. Um, Later editions, later iterations of the game have since kind of pushed that to the background a little bit and made it more of an implied thing rather than the central aspect of the game. And that's what I want to talk about mature themes. The idea that you're playing a monster. A vampire is a monster. They feed on other people. They eat people and often kill people to prolong their life. And so when you're playing vampire, you have to be willing to determine for yourself, how far are you going to go? Will you drink from people but just drink enough to stay alive? Will you lose all control and discard control completely and just kill randomly? Um, that is a part of vampire. And so, like, so what you've gotten in the last 15 years or so is we've edged away from that idea. 15, 20 years, we've edged away from the idea of those mature themes. And we started talking more about, well, if we put that kind of stuff in art, it might offend somebody. Well, I'm going to say this, and I'm going to say it cautiously, but also very strongly, kind of hedging my bet kind of thing. I'm going to be a little bit of a fence sitter here. Sometimes being mature can be a good thing because it allows people to interact with your art in a mature way. You can put, sexually explicit concepts into your art. You can put graphic violence into your art. You can put that kind of stuff into your art and make great art. If it's handled right and it's done maturely and it's done with a mature perspective. Um, and what I mean by that is, going back to the vampire thing, there are a lot of edgelordy people who play vampire or had played vampire at least, that they play vampires to kind of get their jollies off, for lack of a better way of putting it. And when you're playing vampire with a very good group, one of the things I've experienced when playing vampire with solid groups of vampire players is they don't play them like edgelords. They don't uh, willy nilly play vampires like it's funny that they kill people and things like that. It's not a joke to them. Even when you get into some of the subtext of vampire, like the Anarchs or the Sabbat, uh, who are, Sabbat are incredibly dark. If you read the Guide to the Sabbat, you read the Sabbat section of the Storyteller's Handbook, you really get into the Sabbat. The Sabbat do a lot of really messed up stuff, because they basically think the masquerade is a joke and that vampires should rule the world. And they have nothing to be ashamed of for having been turned into vampires. Which gets into a whole, that gets into the sub lore of the anti-tribu versus true clan and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not going to get into all the lore of vampire. But what you can do is, if you're playing that game right, the mature themes of that game can be incredible, because you're exploring something in a mature way. You're actually experiencing something that you may not be able to explore otherwise. You know, and it's a good way to do it. It's a good way to handle it. On the flip side, I'm going to get into a little bit of the negative here. Uh, the negative way to handle mature themes, and I'm going to use a very specific example here because I actually have learned to despise the way that this person handles maturity, the mature themes in his writing, is I think George R. R. Martin's idea of maturity is juvenile, extremely juvenile. His his sex scenes in his books are graphic for no reason. His violence is particularly over the top for the sake of shock value, not because it's necessary. Um, And I say that as somebody who reads a lot of fantasy and sci-fi. You know, plenty of authors have written violent and graphic stories and graphic stuff without needing to do it the way he does it. And the themes that they carry are very similar to some of the themes in Song of Ice and Fire. The morally gray characters, things like that. Um, you know, uh, and the best example I can give you of what I'm talking about is the idea that a lot of people watch Game of Thrones, the show, and Dan Ray's in the show is shown to be like 17 or 18 years old. But if you read the book, she's like 14. And so the very first horribly graphic sex scene in that book between her and Khal Drogo is, first off, is rapey. It's extremely rapey. Um, but it's also extremely, extremely, extremely uncomfortable. Yeah. Um, and that's a huge issue for me in and of itself. Just the idea that he writes this sex scene featuring an underage kid. I mean, it is. People talk about the Stephen King It scene, but at the same time, they praise. Uh, they'll praise to the high heavens George R. R. Martin, and both of those scenes are, in my eyes, equivalent. They're both very awful scenes. Um, if you don't know what I'm talking about, there's about a 6-page scene in it that involves a child sex orgy. I mean, it's pretty graphic. When I read it, I sped read that chapter because I knew it was coming. um, but anyways, the idea being that's an immature way to handle like a mature concept. The idea is that yes, there are things like that that happen in the world, but you don't have to be shockingly graphic about it. You don't have to treat it as if it's basically you don't have to treat it like a 16-year-old would. And you know, and I've seen it a lot in RPGs. As I've kind of aged up and as I've aged and played a lot, uh, I don't deal with a lot of those things in my games because people don't deal with them appropriately most of the time. So things like sex in my games tends to fade to black because of that. It's just not. People are trying to be edge lords, and they're like, "Oh, I'm gonna make this scene into something uncomfortable." No, you're not. I'm not gonna let you. Even in games where those themes feature, thinking unknown armies, cults, uh, yeah, any game like that that features kind of broken people, um, and the concept is you play broken people. So the idea being is when you get into maturity and you talk about mature themes, how you handle them is a big sticking point. So you can defend mature themes. I can sit here and tell people two things. You know, going back to the Goblin Slayer thing, Goblin Slayer itself is a great show. Watch beyond the first episode. I promise you, it is a really good show. But don't focus just on the very mature, you know, the very horrible incident in that takes up a total of about 30 seconds in the first episode. Um, because, like I said, they're doing it for a reason. And that brings up another point too. And like I said, you see this a lot more in Western cultures than you do other cultures, especially Eastern cultures. And that Eastern cultures, Korean, Japanese, Chinese. I'm not as familiar with like South Pacific, so you know I can't talk a lot about like the Philippines and stuff like that. But particularly Japanese, Chinese, and Korean, they get away with a lot more because they handle it appropriately. Um, they don't, generally speaking, and exceptions exist. I know hentai is a thing, and manhwa and webtoon and all that stuff can handle mature themes very inappropriately, particularly sexual assault very inappropriately. But for the most part, when you're talking about Eastern cultures, those three Eastern cultures, those themes are handled very appropriately, and they're handled like what they are, which is they are something that happens in the world, and they are something that happens to people, and they're awful, and that's how you should handle it. And like I said, when you get into the negatives of it, you get into certain people. Another grand example of this for me would be authors like Sarah J. Maas, where her books are basically porn. And I mean, there's a reason that the nickname given to new fantasy is cliterature, which, oh God help me, I can't believe I just had to use that word. Um, the idea being that these new authors are writing about very mature concepts in very immature ways, and the way they write is very immature. Their prose and stuff is terrible. They're not good books. I'm just going to tell you that they're not good books. No matter what people tell you, they're not good books. Um, and there's a reason that the people that we think of in the art community, particularly novels and movies that have made major impacts, uh, generally do not uh, toy around with mature themes. They don't make light of them. So the idea being, I'm going to defend mature themes because mature themes are appropriate and sometimes important to art in different contexts. Like I said, if you're playing Vampire the Masquerade, use those mature themes. Use the idea that you are a monster that is killing other people to continue your own life. Use that theme. Use it appropriately. If you're playing you know, if you're playing a game, um, a fantasy game, and you want to use a mature theme, I'll give you an example. I'm using it in my Deadlands game of they're trying to, and they're getting ready to stop this, but they're trying to sacrifice a child to an eldritch god to let her take over the body of this child. Um, and there's nothing funny about that. The idea is that the characters, you build it up so that the characters feel the same horror that the player would feel at that if they saw it. The idea that you would sacrifice a child for your own betterment, that kind of stuff. There's a reason those things turn us off. So when you're talking about mature themes and art, just remember, guys, it's important to understand how art works, and when it's appropriate, and understanding appropriate context and stuff too matters. Don't just willy-nilly throw murder into your game, a horrible murder in your game because it's a game. uh, or if you're reading a book and there's just over the top violence for just some inexplicable reason, it's probably not a good book. Overall, when you're reading or watching or you're playing games, and like I said, guys, the idea in this video kind of applies to all art, whether it be video games, RPGs, movies, books. Understand, you can use mature themes in mature ways, and you can be very effective and very healthy when doing so. What you cannot do, though, is do not treat mature themes as if they're jokes. Do not treat mature concepts as if they're there to simply be there. They should be there for a reason. Um, like I said, I read a lot of fantasy, a lot of sci-fi, um, and I've read the books. I read Martin. I've read his stuff, and I think he's a hack because of the way he writes. And then I've read Tad Williams. I've read Margaret Weiss. I've read all these big name authors, and another author, by the way, that I would list in the same voice as Martin would be Terry Goodkind. He does similar things, or did. He's no longer alive, unfortunately, which kind of sucks for his fans because there are people that like his books. But the idea being, he did similar things with, particularly with sex, when talking about sex. He just would throw it out there, and it just didn't make any sense. So when you're talking about maturity and using the idea of maturity and using like I said, and I think I'm going to use that term, and I'm going to go ahead and clarify something because I'm using the term mature themes because there's not another way to describe it. But when you're talking about things that are meant for adults, or are kind of adult events that you wouldn't expect a child to really understand, is where I'm going with this. use it appropriately. Don't just shock value your player. Don't just shock value your reader. Don't just shock value people because it's what people do you think people want. And I'll give you a great example of the penultimate thing that bothers me, something that has bothered me in film for years, and thank God they've kind of died off. And that would be the torture porn genre, things like Hostel, latter Saw movies. Um, the first Saw movie was an absolutely great film because it was a psychological thriller and it wasn't really a horror film, and it dealt with some very deeper themes. And then, like by Saw 3, it went from that to how can I torture people? And it was just like, wait, what? And that's a great example of losing focus on how to use the themes that you're going for, because there are actually good there's good principle behind the idea of what Jigsaw is supposedly trying to do, and yada yada yada. He's punishing people for their greater sins and all that stuff. Um, so when you're talking about those kind of themes and those kind of thematics, just remember, guys, you can use them, you can have them around you, you can enjoy them, and I'm sorry, I'm choking yet. I do not know why I always choke when I do a video. Eek. Uh, but when you're talking about that kind of stuff, just remember, guys, you're dealing with something that, in general, is mature because it's awful, because it's sensitive, because it's dark. It doesn't always have to be graphic and violent or anything like that. It can be as simple as a sex scene in a movie, or you know two adults having a realistic argument in a book over like a deep philosophical point. Uh, those are just as mature as anything else, and that's where I feel the need to kind of come out to say, guys, if you're enjoying art, you're enjoying different arts. Really try to gauge whether or not the art itself is worth engaging with based on how they handle the more uh, adult concepts in the art. Don't just read a fantasy book because everyone says it's good. Because I'm telling you guys right now, if you follow that logic, you're going to read a lot of slop. Because right now, a lot of stuff coming out in the book space is trash. It is. I mean, there's a reason it's nicknamed mommy porn and stuff, and it's so. And if you're looking for more mature people to more mature authors, uh, they're out there. They're absolutely out there. James Islington does a great job with mature themes without being immature about them. Joe Abercrombie does a great job with it. John Gwynne does a great job with them. Uh, Mark Lawrence writes incredibly complex characters without the need to be uh, immature about how he handles them. I like a better way of putting it. So when you're looking at that stuff, guys, remember, it's okay to enjoy those mature themes, and it's okay to have them in your art. It's okay to enjoy them in everything you're in. And don't ever let people make you feel guilty because you enjoy something that has mature themes. I have a lot of people that constantly berate me for enjoying Goblin Slayer. Isn't that the rape anime? First off, no. Second off, no. Third off, no. There's one 30-second scene, God forbid, that the Japanese, who do not live by American values, put something in a piece of their art that you find objectionable. And by no means am I saying that you guys have to go out and enjoy what I enjoy. I think I've been pretty clear on the idea that everyone has to find their own comfort levels with what they enjoy, but you know, don't minimize the idea that mature themes can be healthy, and especially when you're playing, especially when you're playing RPGs, especially playing RPGs with people who are supposedly mature. And as a closing note, guys, I just want to make this clear too. It's also perfectly acceptable to have an RPG session where you're very immature. Because sometimes you're playing a game and sometimes it's just fun to be a little immature. and be kind of childish. But for the most part, when you're confronting, and when you're confronting adult themes and adult thematics, you know, really appreciate them for what they are, understand them in context, and make sure that what you're imbibing is not just shock. You know, that would be my best advice. If what you're imbibing is written just to shock the conscience, it's probably not really good art. And that's the final word on that. As like I said at the beginning, guys, I encourage anyone who wants to, please do video response on this, do comments, write a blog post, whatever, because I'd love to see other people's thoughts, comments on this. Because the idea is, like I said, I think over the last 15 or 20 years, as a whole, Western societies have gotten so adverse to the idea of offensiveness that we don't confront mature themes very well, and we don't confront mature concepts very well. And because of that, that leads to things like mommy porn. That leads to things like graphic underage sex scenes. That leads to over the top violence that's completely unnecessary. Uh, that leads to very shallow philosophical points in books. That kind of stuff. So, anyways, guys, as always, thoughts, comments, questions, concerns below. As always, we do hope you guys have fun. We do hope to see you around the game table. And I forgot it. Do follow the 3 rules, guys. No ad hominems, no picking fights, and please, please, please don't leave me college dissertation. I'm not going to read it. I don't have time. But either way, guys,